For decades, Golden's Deli served up some of the borough's finest Jewish cuisine alongside a dining experience like no other in an authentic, retrofitted New York City subway car. Since the restaurant closed in 2012, the train's whereabouts have been a mystery, until now.
We know that vintage stuff is a sweet spot for the newspaper, especially restaurant-themed things. There just seems to be a thing for the old Staten Island. That I started doing some research online, and I found an old Reddit thread or something that talked about the Goldens. It was, or some other kind of thing that mimics that kind of setup. And then I found this gentleman's name, Tom Zufali. This guy is a transit memorabilia nut from his childhood riding the subways in Queens. So some friend of his called, he said, Tom, this is right up your alley. He looks at it and he buys it.
Welcome to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene, a podcast bringing you an inside look at the biggest stories on Staten Island with the reporters who cover them. I'm your host, Erik Bascome, and this week I'm joined by Staten Island Advance senior opinions writer Tom Wrobleski to discuss his recent quest to track down the iconic subway car that once graced one of the borough's most beloved eateries. Thanks for joining me today, Tom. It's crazy to think that 2023 is really coming to a close already, and it's certainly been another eventful year here on Staten Island. And so I was curious, your job as the opinions writer, you get to comment on all these stories.
On your stories.
Yeah, a lot of times on my
So thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. And so I was wondering what stood out to you over the past 12 months as some of the biggest stories and some of the things you're looking at, as we move into the next year.
Well, I think the congestion pricing story that you've been following, that I've been following, and is kind of like been hanging over us here on Staten Island. So I think that, again, the speed cameras, that's always very popular. I'm not just trying to flatter you because these are the stories, but the migrant crisis that we've seen on Staten Island.
That's what stood out to me for sure.
And now you're kind of seeing the real, and again, because now it's money coming out of the pocket, right? You're seeing the real world implications of a political policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the migrant shelter thing, I think, was really kind of took over, especially our team, right, on the public interest and advocacy. For a couple months there, it was just nonstop in terms of the protests and the court lawsuits and the this and the that, and in regards to, how Staten Islanders were responding to these shelters opening up here. And like you said, there really is now the real world implications in terms of we see the amount of money that the city is spending on this. And then you see the proposed budgets come out, and what are they cutting? Is library service going down? Are they canceling school safety agent classes? There's not necessarily a direct connection, but at the same time, if you're going to be spending all of this money on one thing, then you got to spend less money on other things. And
so talking about billions of dollars, like the mayor says, Mayor Adams says, on migrant services. And again, it has so many tentacles, brings so many things into play, the city versus the state and city versus the feds, whose responsibility is it? Now you're starting to feel the sort of gravitational undertow of 2024 as we're all going to start getting pulled forward into the presidential race. So this is a judgment on Biden, how he's managed the border, the Congress members. It's a national story happening in very broad strokes, capital here on Staten Island.
Yep. All right, so let's get to the reason that I have you on today. And, I mentioned it in the outset, but...
You made it sound so cool the way you described it, too. The detective story.
Well, you did do quite a bit of sleuthing here. And so we've been talking about this for a long time in the newsroom. I feel like this goes back for a while. It's like, whatever happened with that? Because we saw every time that we rolled out any of this Golden's Deli content, these nostalgia, vintage photos, whatever kinds of posts, that it was resonating, right? And so we'll get to that stuff later. But first, I want to just give a brief overview for the people who might not know it, the younger audience, or the people who may not have visited there. Just tell us a little bit about what Golden's Deli was, where it was, and just that kind of stuff.
Well, I have to tell you, I had never been there, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
So no, I had never been there. I remembered, people talking about it. It was over in New Springville, where the old Kmart used to be, but that was the general area of where that was. And again, it was one of those places that there was a lot of regular customers went there, like Jade Island as well, which is another one of those venerable places. It was there for a long time. And the key selling point, besides the food, which I understand was delicious, was this a real subway car, not just a mock-up or cardboard or plastic, an actual real. Now I don't know how they got their hands on it. And the subway car was built in the 1930s, I believe 1938 or 39. So they had it there. They had it all decked out for dining. So that was one of the big hooks for the place. It's an interesting kind of dining experience. Yeah. It's like I went to a place in Pittsburgh, which I know is close to your heart, which is was in an old bank. And,
really?
And the vault had tables in it.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
and the bar was like an old, where they had
like the bank teller.
Yeah, like the customer service, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of dining experience, and then the place closes in 2012, and so people lament, the closure of the place in and of itself, a piece of Staten Island iconography, and then they say, "Well, whatever happened to the subway car?"
Yeah. And that's what you tried to figure out. And yeah, so just quickly before we get into all of that stuff, I was one of those regulars at Golden's Deli, or my family was. Obviously, I was a kid at the time, but we went there quite often. Particularly my grandparents were from Brooklyn. They're both Jewish. And so they would come to Staten Island and visit us. We would bring the whole family out there. The sad part for me was because we were a larger group, we could rarely sit in the subway car because there would be my family of 5, and then we had the 2 grandparents, so there's 7 of us. So we end up outside the car at one of the big tables, and I'm always peeking my head open
against the window.
Exactly.
So sad.
Yeah. And so I didn't get to sit in the car quite as much as I used to, but I did love that place, and we went there a lot.
Did you take pictures? Did you take pictures for us?
You know what? That's a good question. My dad has tons of old photo albums. I should go through those and see if we've got anything in there.
Gold.
But I will shout out the matzo ball soup there. That was the first place that I really had it, and it is still, one of my favorites to this day. Yeah, definitely shout out Golden's Deli. Totally miss them. We don't really have anything like that right now on Staten Island in terms of a proper Jewish deli restaurant.
A sit-down place.
Exactly, yes.
With atmosphere, right.
So, all right, so let's get back to the subway car and just talk to me a little bit about why you decided to kind of track this thing down and what the process was like in terms of finding it, because obviously it's been 10 years, and I don't even know what you had to go off of. So how did you find this thing?
Well, we know that vintage stuff is a sweet spot for the newspaper, especially restaurant-themed things. It just seems to be a thing for the old Staten Island. That, again, you're getting to the age now where some of the things you remembered
as a kid
from the 90s or whatever, and we knew every time we ran something out about Golden's Deli, people were reading it. I'm kind of like a transit geek a little bit. I mean, I follow your footsteps a little bit with that. So I started doing some research online, and I found it was either an old Reddit thread or something that talked about the Golden, or some other kind of thing that mimics that kind of setup.
Yeah.
Or like an old chat room.
Yeah, like an old forum. Yeah.
Yeah, an old chat room, with transit geeks. I saw the mention Warwick, New York in there. So I started doing some research, not knowing, of course, that I think Mark Stein, one of our colleagues, and Paul Yoda, one of our colleagues, had also tried to sort this thing out, a couple of years ago. So I'm looking online. So I was like, okay, Warwick, New York, that sounds like a good. So I called the Historical Society in Warwick, New York. I called the Chamber of Commerce in Warwick, New York. I'm kind of saying, it just seems, and some people I don't know. I hear something about that. I don't know. And then I found this gentleman's name, Tom Zufali. I found it online somewhere. I look him up, and it's kind of like he's an art installer. And I'm like, okay, he's an art installer. It doesn't really sound like it matches. Then my colleague Mark, who I do the Facebook Live with as well, said, oh yeah, I think that rings a bell with me. Let me look back and see if I have an email. So he forwarded me an email thread where we kind of tracked this guy down, and this was the guy. There was an email address, and that's how I initially got in touch with the guy.
Wow. And so I'm curious, how did he get this subway car up to Warwick? Because obviously that's a bit of a chore, I would imagine, bringing the subway car up. Because for people who don't know, Warwick's about an hour and a half, 2 hours.
About an hour and a half up. Nice, great place.
Oh, it's beautiful. I go there. I have
right.
friends there. There's some great disc golf courses out there if anyone's looking to play some disc golf. So, but yeah, so how did he get the car up there?
Well, so he's an art installer. Now, when I say art installer, you think it's like you're hanging a picture on the wall. Now, this is a guy, he's worked for S.I.Deli. He's worked for big corporate clients. He's worked for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When you've got a painting that has to go on a whole wall, you don't just drive a couple of nails in the wall and put some hangers on. Or you're suspending something from the ceiling. So this guy's into this very high-end stuff, and I'm telling you, he must do very well at what he does.
Right.
Because he's got the means. He's got a 7-acre piece of property in Warwick. Somebody else bought it from Golden's, and I was never able to track down who bought it from Golden's, and they had it, and it was stored kind of outside in like a lot in Brooklyn, and then Con Ed was kind of in the neighborhood, and they were building something behind it, and he put it up for sale because it was going to get enclosed eventually. It's kind of a detail that I was able to. It was going to get boxed in by some other building that was going on. This is more detail than I put into the story.
That's what the podcast is for.
Exactly.
Got to bring behind the scenes.
So this guy is a transit memorabilia nut. All right, and for real, from his childhood riding the subways in Queens. So some friend of his called. He said, "Tom, this is right up your alley. Why don't you go?" So he looks at it and he buys it. So of course, he spent about $15,000 to buy it. It was in very bad condition, been stored outside. It was all, run down. So he basically, he hires a Manhattan firm. They put it on a flatbed.
Yeah.
Takes it up there. Now, the thing interesting was, I wish I had film of this. We had some photos of it that went in with the story that we did. This flatbed had to back down like a kind of a serpentine, kind of snaky driveway.
To get into his
property, which, those roads are very narrow. You're in the woods. So that's big. And then he had to have a crane there to lift it off the flatbed and to place it on a concrete flooring that he had built. He's kind of got a barn area in the back of his home where it's like his playhouse where he does all his remodeling stuff. Very handy guy, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. He's got all this other stuff on his property as well. So that's how he got it up there. So this like his motto for his art installation business is, hey, if it's impossible, call me. So he had the knowledge and the means.
Seems like the perfect guy for that. Yeah.
And when he was rolling it in, you could still see it said Golden's in the window, and it was still that kind of yellow color that people remember. Now it's been repainted to its old traditional like a dark green color.
Yeah. And so when you found this guy, you decided to take a trip up there yourself, right?
Yes.
To interview him, get some photos, all that kind of stuff. So tell me a little bit about that process, because obviously it's a nice little drive. You get to go up there, enjoy being out of the city for a little bit, but also I know you were doing a lot of work because we've put out so much content surrounding this. So tell us a little bit about what your trip was like.
It probably took over 2 months to finally zero in, because the gentleman, Tom Zuffali, does a lot of travel for his job. He goes overseas. He doesn't know what his schedule is all the time. Mm-hmm. So, I think I first contacted him at the end of September. I didn't go up there until, I guess it was November, or I don't even know when the story was just published. It took a long time. And again, I'll be in just a full disclosure. I went up on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. So my wife traveled with me. So we did a Sunday in Warwick and the surrounding area, Drowned Lands Brewery, and we went into town. And then the Monday we went to a gentleman's property, and we saw the car. Obviously, he totally renovated it. He put a real bar in the back of it, because the back of it, if you remember from Golden, it was kind of attached to the restaurant,
to the back wall.
Right. So there was no back to it.
It was kind of cut off.
Yeah. So he put it back on it. And then he built a bar in the back. And in fact, his daughter had been married on the property. It's a beautiful property. Photographers come and use his property to take photos for weddings and different things. So his daughter had her reception on the grounds, and the bar was used for the wedding. He's got these cane seats, which older riders will remember from the Staten Island trains, and also they're kind of like, it's hard to describe. They're like these yellow seats. He's got one original one from the 30s on there. He's got all sort of period advertisements, and he painted the original color. He has original plating with the number on it. He built a mock train platform with actual signs from subway stops in Queens that he remembers as a child. So when you roll up to the property, there's the train, there's an overhang, and then there's a platform that you can and you walk through it. Guy couldn't have been nicer, and could tell you everything. And he showed us his whole collection of different trains. He's got buses. He's got a toy train that goes around that his grandkids ride on, that he bought from an amusement park. He's got all this memorabilia. It was a fantastic trip.
Yeah, and I was curious, because it sounds like, in reading some of your articles, that obviously this guy is just a transit enthusiast and a restorationist in many senses of the way. Yes. So I saw one of your articles just kind of talking about that and why he does what he does in that regard. So can you talk to us just a little bit about why he is so interested in restoring these cars and making sure that they kind of still live on as they outlive their useful lifespan, I guess?
One of the things that first started him collecting, besides his childhood, his dad served in the Pacific during World War II. Like my dad, when he served in the service later, you take a train across the country and then, they ship you overseas. Mm-hmm. And he rode this Southern Pacific train. The father never talked about his military service, like a lot of folks of that generation. But he talked about the train and sort of the romance. And, this is something that you can appreciate as well. I mean, there's a romance to these long-distance train rides. You're seeing different parts of the country. So this really kicked this thing off for this collector. And he has the means, clearly, to do this. He also believes that as Americans, we're kind of in a disposable society. And again, like I'm almost 60. I've been hearing this all my life. You've been hearing it. And even now, it's even more so. Your cell phone, your telephone, your laptop, your whatever, it's a year or two.
You all switch it out.
Nobody buys cars anymore. They lease them, and then 2 years later you can
lease a new one.
So he says we're a little too quick to get rid of the past, and there's parts of America that are just vanishing. and including like how we used to get around. Because so that's what really inspires him. And he's got stuff from when he was a child, his Roy Rogers, like a lunchbox from the 40s or 50s. I mean, real vintage, and the stuff is in pristine condition. He said his parents hated it because he goes, "Oh, my bedroom used to be like an antique shop."
Yeah.
And my parents couldn't stand it.
That's funny. And so is this his property? Is it open? Can anyone go up and see this car, or is this just like on his closed?
I mean, you drive by. It's a public road, and you kind of have to go down the hill a little bit, like his driveway. But you'll see a big a railroad crossing arm.
Oh, cool.
With lights. I don't know if it lights up at night, but
yeah,
you'll kind of see that. And if you're going back the other way, you'll see some of the stuff. He's got an old city bus back there.
Oh, really?
That was from I guess it must have been from the 50s or 60s, from when he was a kid. He goes, "This is the same kind of bus I used to ride to high school." I forget the name of the high school. It was in Queens. So he goes, so he bought one of those, and he's going to restore the inside of that. One of the trains, he bought a caboose for the train that his father took. Mm-hmm. While his house was being built, he lived in the train on the property. And now it's like the changing room for his pool. So when you're going to go to the pool, you go in there. And he's in the process of restoring the interior of that as well. Plus, he's got all the stuff in the house. He's got a tile from the subway. He's got a tile that says like a mosaic tile, Fifth Avenue train stop. Fascinating thing he told me was not all of them were grouted. They put the tiles on, but they can be rolled up. Like a canvas painting.
Yeah, and then you unroll it.
And then you unroll it and you stick it on. So he's going to move that out somewhere outside, put it outside by the train so people can see that. Because at first a lot of his collection was inside. Now a lot of his collecting is like actually on the grounds. If you pass by, you can probably, and you know who this guy is.
Yeah,
you can probably catch sight of it. And listen, knock on the door.
Yeah,
not to encourage people to just wander on it,
but seems like a nice guy, and he's got some cool stuff to show off.
And we didn't make use of the bar in the car because we were working at the time.
Of course.
But certainly, I mean, that might be part of the trip too.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it was a really cool trip, and I've really been enjoying the content that has been coming out of it. And so I wanted to talk a little bit before we go just about our company's emphasis on some of this vintage and nostalgic content that we roll out on a pretty regular basis now. And I don't know if this is something that we've always been doing here, if this is kind of picked up in the last few years, but why kind of the emphasis on rolling out this content these days?
Now I can remember, I've been here since 1995, and we used to do a feature, I don't know if we still do it, called The Way It Was. Mm-hmm. And I know Mike Azara did this. He was the political writer before I was the political writer a couple of years. He would find like an old photo of a street corner on Staten Island and said, "Do you know what this looks like today? And can you name?" It was almost like it was a contest.
Yeah.
It's a very popular feature. And I think now that we have so many things that can be photo-centric, we realize people are like, I remember when Annandale looked like that. Or, over by Al Deppies, like how Staten Islanders give, directions. Oh, the old Crazy Eddie.
Yeah.
People remember, or the old airport, or the old this and that. You'll be doing it. I'm sure you do it now. Like, in my neighborhood where Miggy's used to be, now it's an I say, by Miggy's. It used to be Miggy's or whatever. So, and I think that there's just a sweet spot for people because you don't listen. You don't realize that you're getting older, right? None of us do.
I do. I'm turning 30 this year, so I realize.
So I'll be turning 60 next year. And I always tell people, youth is not an accomplishment, like it's a gift. Yeah. And you already look back with fondness to things that you remember when you were a kid or when you were a teenager, wherever you used to hang out, where you were drinking beers, where this store used to be, with the place you used to go to buy video games, which nobody does anymore because you're on Steam or you do whatever. And you don't realize that that's, this is a little more philosophical maybe. I found this. The older you get, the more you reach back. Mm-hmm. When you're 25, 30, you want to get out on your own, your parents, whatever you want to make. Then you kind of you want to have the people and the friends around you who remember what Erik was like when he was 15, when he was in high school, and the stuff that you used to do together. And we have actually, and now we're like, when you go somewhere, take a picture. Because we don't have a lot of stuff anymore. Because back in that day, we didn't take a picture of a new restaurant. Maybe we didn't think about it, yeah. We didn't think about it. There were all those stores in the mall we never took pictures of, Bun and Burger or Walden Books from my generation. Or Paperback.
Think of the Warner Brothers store from when I was a kid. You got the little rocket ships.
So we had a bookstore, the Paperback Booksmith I used to go to all the time, and next door was a place that served knishes, not like the Golden Knishes,
right?
But it was knishes. I used to go buy a book, sit there, and have a knish. That was like part of my teenage
experience.
Life.
Yeah.
The Island Theater or the old movie theaters, stuff like that. And I think people really vibe with that, and we see it in the numbers. And again, a lot of this is content we already have.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I always call it like couch cushion money. It's like it's just waiting there to be picked up. And I'm lucky that this late in my career, I've actually found something that I'm really interested in doing, especially if I can meet somebody personally, like Tom Zaffali, like this gent, and I can really get there and it's something I can see and touch. I think, I feel very lucky when I get a story like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about, you said it was called The Way It Was or something like that. I think now our current version of that is the Then and Now.
Then and
right?
Now, right.
And Jan runs that out sometimes. We'll have the photos of Victory Boulevard in 1912.
Correct.
And you're looking at it and it's, got a little horse and buggy and some oil street lamps and stuff like that. And then you see it today and it's really quite jarring in a lot of ways. Or
the newspaper pages that we run out, the historic page from the 50s.
When I was an intern, I can't tell you how many historic pages I did.
I can't tell you how many stories I've gotten off those pages. There was, including a story about how Staten Island has continued to pay tax money for the subway line that was never built.
Wow.
Because on one of those pages, it had, because the train line was supposed to go past their houses and it was fronted, people were paying money.
Mm-hmm.
Gold mine.
Well, it is, and you really can, like you said, not only for us from a content view perspective, but we also I learned so much about the borough going through that stuff, especially because, like I said, that was when I was an intern, I was doing a lot of these things, and like, I am a native Staten Islander, I've been here my whole life, but you only really learn so much about your borough's history through school. You're learning U.S. history, world history, all this kind of stuff. So when I got here and I was going through some of that content, I was like, Staten Island has a way more storied history than I realized in a lot of senses. And so I found that stuff really cool and interesting to learn about. And I think in some ways our readers feel the same. There's the people who are reading those kinds of things just because they want to reminisce and they want to look back. And then there's people who are like, wait, that happened here? That's pretty cool. And so I think that's kind of two sides of it as to why this resonates with our readers, but it certainly does. And so I was wondering, as one last thing before we go, if there's anything else on your hit list right now of Staten Island relics that you could maybe track down. I don't know what that might be.
Everybody talks about the Victory Diner, and unfortunately, the Victory Diner, after it was moved off of Richmond Road, was destroyed in Hurricane Sandy. I like to do abandoned or vacant sites as well. I mean, I'd love to get inside. This is like my white whale. My kids know about it too. The old Wrigley chewing gum factory that's in Clifton. There's lottery stuff that I'm doing. There's people love mob stuff on Staten Island. I don't have a thing yet, but I'm sure I'll find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Tom. It's always a pleasure having you on, and hope you enjoy the holidays, and looking forward to all the work together in the new year.
Absolutely. You as well. You're doing great work.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene. If you like what you've heard, please make sure to rate and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit SILive.com for the latest on all these stories and more. Thank you for supporting local journalism.